Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Ambassador. Okay, so it's now 4:45 in Beijing, so we're going to begin the webinar. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to those of you joining us from the UK. My name is Tom Simpson, and I'm the China Managing Director at the China-Britain Business Council based in Beijing. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar with Ambassador Dame Barbara Woodward, where we will be discussing the subject of UK-China relations in the context of COVID-19. I would like to take this moment to say a big thank you to Dame Barbara and her team for the opportunity to put together today's session. These are very challenging times for many, including the British government here in China, so we greatly appreciate the Ambassador taking the time to speak to us today. Before we begin, I would like to give a brief recap on the rundown for today's session. There will be 3 segments to the webinar, consisting of remarks from CBBC's Chair, Shashera Kubikols, followed by key messages from the Ambassador, and then a dialogue between Dame Barbara and CBBC's Andrew People, including questions submitted by our audience during the registration. Note that we will be recording today's session and we'll share the link in due course. So that's all from my side. I would now like to hand over to Shashera to give today's opening remarks.
Good. Well, thank you, Tom. And has my microphone been unmuted? I think it's done remotely, isn't it?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me. Good. Yep. Because it's still showing me as mute on my screen. Okay. Well, welcome, Barbara. And can I just echo what Tom said? We in the UK have been full of admiration for you personally, staying on the bridge throughout this crisis, dashing back to London, dashing back to Beijing, coping with all sorts of demands, including supplying material to the National Health Service. But we are so proud of the role you've played in representing the United Kingdom in China during this crisis, and very privileged to have you briefing us and our members today. We've got over 200 people have asked to join the webinar. You know exactly what a critical period this is in relations between China and the world. On the one hand, we see China perhaps ahead of the rest of the world in coping with this terrible virus. But we also see, for example, in today's London Times, an article by Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, symbolizing the more intelligent end of some of the anti-China feeling that we see in the UK and the US and elsewhere in the West. So thank you again for taking part. The main meat of the seminar is a conversation between you and Andrew People, the advocacy leader at the CBBC, who served in both Beijing and Hong Kong with the Wall Street Journal. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Barbara. I think you may want to make some introductory remarks, and then you'll have a conversation with Andrew.
Excellent. Well, Sherard, thank you very much indeed for those kind words, and also Tom for your introduction, and to everyone who's dialed in today. I very much look forward to deepening the dialogue. I thought in my introductory remarks I'd cover 3 broad things. The first is to give those of you back in the UK a bit of a ground truth of what it's like here in China. The second, to give you a very quick rundown of what the embassy has been doing in the last 12 weeks, and then perhaps a few remarks about the current state of UK-China relations, which I'm sure we can pick up further in discussion with Andrew. So if I start with the SITREP, spring has come to China, for those of us who are here in Beijing or across China. We are promised that the restrictions on people in Wuhan will be lifted tomorrow, although there are already some limitations on that. Today is the first day that China has reported no further deaths from coronavirus. And against that, around 20 provinces have now opened or partially opened schools. And we hear that some universities in Nanjing, for example, are opening. The government has put in place a solid stimulus package. And there is across the country, I think, a strong sort of back to normal vibe. And that is probably most strong in Shanghai, although the schools haven't opened there. And some industry and some sectors are, of course, doing very well. It's the ones you'd predict around tech, education, technology, health, those sort of ones. But I would say, set against that, some quite stringent restrictions remain in place across China. They vary by province, but here in Beijing, we have our temperatures taken to get in and out of residential compound buildings, parks, shops, and so on. Social distancing, quarantine is still very strict, returning from across China or overseas, it's mandatory. China has now closed its borders to foreigners, and flights are running at about 10% of normal capacity. So it's a much more isolated place than it was 3 months ago. It is true, I think, that there are signs of xenophobia. I've heard reports of a sign in an upmarket hotel in Guangzhou saying no sick people and no foreigners. And I've heard too reports of unprovoked abuse against foreigners. I think there is too, despite the fact that there's no new deaths reported today, there is concern about a second wave coming as people begin to move around the country. And only last week, a county in Henan province was locked down. So that's 600,000 people locked down as a precaution after 3 doctors were tested positive for COVID there. There are, of course, huge questions about China's economic recovery after this. When you look at the data for the first 2 months of this year, industrial production is down 13.5%, fixed asset investment down 24.5%, retail down around 20%, unemployment up around 6%, and of course with around 8.5 million graduates due to come onto the labour market later this year. That's quite a worrying trend. So I would say that at the moment, certainly China has moved through one phase of this, but we're not entirely back to business as usual just yet. Sherard, you very kindly alluded to some of the things that we've been doing over the last 3 months. I would say there's been 3 phases in our work. The first was the humanitarian evacuations. We brought over 200 Brits and some other people out of Wuhan on 4 different flights, and we took aid into Wuhan that was very generously donated on those flights that we organised. We then had a major staff drawdown, so from 800 people at their desks on any one day across China, I'm down to just over 40 at their desks, and we've stood up a remote working operation. But we have taken 200 families or 200 members of families out of China, and they are working remotely back in the UK. And we have temporarily closed our consulates general in Chongqing and in Wuhan as well. The embassy then moved into a 3rd phase where we were focusing on procurement, as you alluded to, Sherard. So primarily ventilators, personal protection equipment, gowns, masks, gloves and things, and also medical and testing equipment and components, because part of the problem of getting ventilators online was, of course, the global supply chain, which has been disrupted by coronavirus. And then we added to that a logistics operation. So we had Wheels Up Today on our 3rd flight out of China. That flight has got 50 ventilators on it, 1 million gloves, 300 boxes of face shields, 24 boxes of coveralls and so on. So you can see quite how agile my team has been in doing all of this. And in all of this time, of course, we've continued to provide consular service for British citizens, particularly those who found themselves either in difficulty getting out of the country or in quarantine or in distress while the arrangements have been in place. So quite a shift in focus for us, but still very committed to supporting British people and British interests here in China. The third question I wanted to float was, of course, what does this mean for UK-China relations? And Sherard, you mentioned the Tom Tugendhat piece in today's Times. There's obviously been the Foreign Affairs Committee report behind that and some other media coverage around the weekend. But I want to say that behind that, the Prime Minister and President Xi Jinping have had two very productive phone calls, obviously covering the immediate pressures of COVID-19, but also looking ahead to long-term UK-China cooperation and also cooperation in multilateral fora, such as the G20. The Prime Minister's had an exchange of letters with Premier Li Keqiang, and then we've had behind that interactions between the Foreign Secretary and State Councillor Wang Yi, the Commerce Minister Zhong Shan and his opposite number, Secretary of State Liz Truss, the Secretary for Health Matt Hancock has been in touch with his opposite number, and the Chancellor is due to speak to Vice Premier Hu Chunhua later this week. So I think some very strong bilateral contacts, and those have been repeated in some of the international meetings that have been taking place, particularly around the G20 format. In terms of business-to-business interaction, last year was a watershed year. For the first time, bilateral trade exceeded $100 billion. So huge thanks to you and your membership for all you've done to support that. I think there is therefore plenty to build on in momentum opening up the market, but I recognise that this is a particularly difficult time, and especially so for SMEs trading with China. And DIT has set up a special support link for those businesses to get in touch with. And businesses have been very strong in supporting China through donations as well. And then on people-to-people links, the real underpinning of the relationship, those I think have been robust too. Obviously, we don't have a strong tourism component just now, but NGOs have been working closely with China and in particular in Wuhan, and we've seen some really quite adorable messages from primary school children sent to the people of China through this difficult time. So overall, I recognise some of the noise around the relationship, but I just wanted to ground our conversation in the fact that I think that UK-China relations are standing up very well during this testing time and deepening in the process. There's obviously new areas for us to explore as we come out of the acute period of COVID-19, but some of the things we've been doing, particularly around climate change, global development, science and technical cooperation, we will be able to resume, I'm sure, very soon. I don't deny, and this is the last thing I wanted to say, that there is a big question around how the world, the global economy, recovers from all of this, and it will be complicated, of course, by different timing for different countries. But I do think, as the G20 leaders concluded, that coordination is going to be extremely important, and the UK and China are working in those fora too. So that's how I thought I'd set the scene for you, Sherard and Andrew, but very happy now to pick up questions and take the dialogue further. Thank you all very much.
There, just checking that you can hear me properly. Thank you very much for your comments, and let me add my thanks to you for taking the time today to speak with us at a very difficult time, both in the UK and in China. Can I ask, first of all, you talked about a sense in China of trying to get back to normal. How would you characterize the level of capacity at which the Chinese economy is working at the moment? And what's your feeling as to when it can get back to, 100% of where the economy was operating before the coronavirus crisis?
I think that is something that you need to break down by sector. So our impression is that for some of the large state-owned enterprises, they are operating at something fairly close to normal, depending on which sector they are in. I think sectors such as communications technology, anything that is supporting remote working and remote education, is working at super hot. Zoom, for example, is doing particularly well, and the Chinese equivalents have all been doing very well indeed. But there's a ground truth behind some of this. When we have been around in Beijing, in Guangzhou and in Shanghai, we see probably in Guangzhou and Shanghai about 40 to 45% of migrant workers back at work on things that you would expect them to be working on, so construction sites, for example. I would say that number is quite a lot lower in Beijing. Our sort of rough estimate would probably be around 15% in terms of construction site activity. And another bit of observation, whereas the roads are quite busy here, when we look at peak traffic flows, that looks like people driving themselves around in safety. Metro, subway is probably working at 50 or 60%, but there is really no one on the buses, which is of course the cheapest form of transport and the one that migrant workers would most obviously be drawn to. So I think it varies sector by sector and it varies across China, but there's definitely some return to normality, but some reservations about really how confident people are in returning to work.
We've seen obviously some stimulus efforts by the Chinese authorities, but perhaps maybe not quite as large in scale, certainly as after the financial crisis, and maybe compared to other countries, particularly the UK. Do you see any shift in policy priorities in Beijing? And do you see talk of more stimulus efforts being needed for the economy?
So I would say that to date, the Chinese economic stimulus has been pretty targeted, pretty measured, and focused on keeping business alive. So very practical, specific measures around reducing social security payments and rents, returning unemployment insurance contributions, cutting taxes, fees, utility costs, and things like that. At the higher financial level, the central bank has cut interest rates, and for the banking sector, bank reserve requirements have been cut as well. That was the sort of first tranche, and then I would say in a second tranche, there's been more of a shift to support demand, so more investment in 5G and some local measures to try and spur consumption. Looking at the package overall, I would agree with what I think is the inference behind what you're saying, Andrew. We reckon stimulus is currently around 2% of GDP. That is well below where it was for the 2008-9 crisis, and it's quite a long way below what we have done in the UK and what other European countries have done, and so that would be in double digits of percentage of GDP. China's been pretty clear so far that 2009 style stimulus is not on the cards. But I think there still are concerns about wages, and as unemployment rises, there may be further measures to look at that. But at the moment, I would say a fairly targeted and measured response.
Turning to the state of the virus itself in China, you talked about fears now of a second wave. Obviously, very welcome news about that the data is showing that the number of deaths and cases is being reduced quite rapidly now in China. But of course, there's been a lot of speculation outside of China about the accuracy of that data. To what extent do you feel that we can trust the data coming out of China on coronavirus? And do you have any channels that suggest that the picture is actually worse than the authorities in China have disclosed so far?
So I think that China has made quite strenuous efforts around reporting the data. I think that for China, as for a lot of countries, the speed at which the virus has advanced has made it difficult to keep up with the numbers at times. I think we still don't know exactly what the numbers are in China, but I think two things are worth watching. The first is the trend, and definitely the line has smoothed out, and then today with the 0 deaths recorded, I think is an important moment in China. But clearly last week, the pop-up of the county in Henan when 600,000 people were put under lockdown is an indication that the virus is still around in China. The other thing that we've been taking as a sort of proxy for what's going on is what the leadership is doing. So when President Xi Jinping went to Wuhan, that for us was an indication of a measure of confidence in control in Wuhan. And again, the Xi Jinping visit to Zhejiang province was not only a signal of economic stimulus, but also a signal that there was enough confidence for the president and members of the Politburo to be traveling around. So we're taking the data more as trends, but also looking at other signals that corroborate that. So opening the schools, I think, shows a level of confidence. We don't have a date yet for the postponed Lianhui, the twin meetings that usually take place in March. There's some speculation that they might take place in May, but we're not there yet. And particularly with quarantine in Beijing, for anyone coming in from outside of 2 weeks, it would take a while to organise those meetings too.
And can I ask, what is your assessment of how the Chinese leadership has emerged from this crisis? Obviously, there seemed to be a moment of danger around February time, particularly around the death of the Dr. Li Wenliang, and a lot of speculation about Xi Jinping's authority at that time. But now we're a month or two on from that. What's your feeling about how the leadership has emerged from this crisis?
Yeah. So I would agree with you, Andrew. It's been an up and down road. I wouldn't go as far as saying a roller coaster. I mean, I would say that President Xi Jinping was a bit absent to start with, and then came forward and very strongly indicated that he personally had been following the virus very closely, and that he personally was in control of what was going on. And we've seen a return in some places to the rhetoric around Xi Jinping being a core leader and even a people's leader, which has been one of the highest accolades that has been attributed to him. So I think that the Chinese leadership is at the moment in a pretty strong place. We've seen them not only domestically, as I say, Xi Jinping has been down to Wuhan and to Zhejiang, but also on the international stage. So the Chinese have been playing quite a leading role in discussions in various G20 fora, trade ministers, finance ministers, and leaders themselves. We've been talking to the Chinese about a United Nations Security Council approach to the coronavirus and some of the security aspects. And the Chinese have been very forward-leaning on that. So at the moment, I would say that the leadership feels quite confident in what they've been able to achieve in China, and are projecting a very strong, calm and confident narrative overseas. And of course, as Sherrod alluded to earlier, some of that has come up a bit of a cropper in the media. So there's a point to unravel there. But here, it feels as if the leadership is very much in control.
Well, let me turn a little to the reaction and relations between the UK and China. First, let me ask, what are we doing now? What are you doing in the embassy? What are we doing more generally to learn from the way that China is dealing with the coronavirus, given that they are somewhat ahead of us in terms of the cycle here? Obviously, we have very difficult political and economic systems, but is there anything that we can learn in terms of the exit strategy from coronavirus, from the way that China has handled this crisis?
So we've been sending back to London all along, as it were, regular updates on some of the measures that China has taken. Of course, we caveat those by acknowledging that we both have rather different systems. So some of the measures that have been taken here wouldn't necessarily work in the UK. They wouldn't even be possible to apply them. And of course, we've caveated some of our understanding of the data. But broadly, the analysis around quarantining, social isolation, there's been a bit less testing here, but all of those things we have shared with London in terms of measures. And then in terms of sort of exit strategy, we've obviously shared our own economic stimulus, and we've been following the economic stimulus that China has been applying, and obviously sharing details in the G20 as well. I think the big question is going to be how the disease works its way through countries of the world, and therefore the sequential impact on the global economy. So China obviously has taken a first hit. We're seeing going through Europe now, we're seeing it going through the United States. We've got the first instances of the disease in Africa, and of course India is in complete lockdown. So there's going to be a clear sort of wave of action, and then a question around whether there's going to be a second wave, because realistically there is no expectation of a vaccine for the next 12 to 18 months. So we need to be prepared to manage our way through until then.
you mentioned the vaccine there. What is going on between the UK and China in terms of working on research into this virus, its causes, and potential cures and vaccines?
So there's a lot of work going on, both on vaccines, but also on the applicability of trials for existing drugs as well. The Chinese have got phase 1 clinical trials already going on in Wuhan. They've slightly presented themselves, I would say, as being ahead of the curve on that, but I think their fundamental analysis is sound, but we think they're probably around the same stage as we are in terms of a race to develop a vaccine. And we're all working in coordination with the WHO's CEPI fund as well. So there is some coordination, but also some localized work going on as well. And then work, as I said, on use of existing drugs against COVID-19. But the really important thing, of course, is around the quality, the sample sizes, the clinical testing, and that is why most of the experts say that it'll be 12 to 18 months before we see a vaccine.
Can I take both yourself and Sir Sherard alluded to some of the voices we're hearing in Parliament here and in the media that are more hostile towards China, and in particular its initial reaction to the emergence of the virus back late last year. What can we do to ensure that this doesn't devolve into a broader blame game and that what you talked about in terms of cooperation becomes more of a priority? How do we talk to politicians and those in the media who are looking to blame China for this virus and its spread around the world?
So I think the question of blame is obviously very tempting, but as you suggest, Andrew, not a very productive avenue. I think where we need to focus our attention now is on, first of all, making sure that we don't get something like this again. So both the WHO and the Convention on Biodiversity have proposed as a first measure banning the sort of wet markets where we believe the virus developed, as it were. So I think it's a point about getting to the origins of the problem rather than slinging mud at in an attempt to attribute blame. But I also think it's important not to shut the stable door after the horse. No, that's not the metaphor I'm looking for, but not to assume that the next black swan crisis will be another global health crisis. So of course we need to take measures that close down wet markets, protect biodiversity and ensure that we don't see those again. But let's also think laterally about the possible triggers for another similar crisis and make sure that we have measures in place for those. The UN, for example, in their latest report said the risk of this disease would not be so great if we had made more progress with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Health Goals in particular. So it's a balanced thing, not just addressing the past, but looking to the future as well, I think.
Yes, of course, there'll be future crises where we need cooperation with China, and it might not be to do with pandemics, as you say. But what is your broader assessment of the state of UK-China relations at the moment? We obviously had the talk of the golden era. Are we still there? Are we still in a good time for UK-China relations more broadly?
I think we're in a very good time for UK-China relations. Obviously, the golden era was the product of Xi Jinping's state visit back in the autumn of 2015. So we are now nearly 5 years into that. And over that 5 years, I would say we have built in a lot of resilience. We've made, as I said, great progress on bilateral trade through incremental progress on market access. And that 100 billion was a real landmark, I think, last year in bilateral trade. Strong people-to-people links, and then the government-to-government ones, which make such a difference. And President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang have both had productive exchanges with the Prime Minister, and as I say, also across the cabinet. We haven't had the programme of visits that we would normally expect with a new government with an 80-seat majority, but COVID-19 has intervened, and they're certainly finding ways to use technology and telephones to stay in touch with each other. So I think the relationship is demonstrating its resilience and deepening at the same time. Of course, we're in a fast-moving environment. We have got to deal with challenges such as cyber attacks, challenges such as Chinese infiltration into some of our academic institutions and things like that. And that's going to become more important, but that is in the context of, I think, a stronger and deeper bilateral relationship that is held together well right at the very top.
You talked about worrying signs of anti-foreigner sentiment in China at the moment. Is there an awareness in China, do you think, both at government levels and amongst the broader population, that China is facing blame for this virus outside of China, both in the UK, but I think obviously more particularly in the United States?
Yes, I think so. But I also think that this is becoming a bit of a circular argument. So the blame argument has played into some of the tensions in US-China relations, where there has been quite a war of words, although following the latest phone call between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, there's been a dialing down of rhetoric and things have been going more smoothly. And behind all of that, the phase 1 trade deal is still on track. So I think it's as usual with many of these things, there's a lot of rhetoric and there's quite a lot of heat in some of the rhetoric. But behind that, my sense is that China and the US are working together quite well in some of these areas. I think that in terms of popular perceptions, Chinese people across China have been fed a pretty relentless diet of information and even propaganda from their own government. They're well able to assess some of that. But the latest narrative has been around the increase in cases coming from people coming back from overseas. Now, that has not always been explained clearly, because the facts are that 90% of the people who've been flying in from overseas have been Chinese people who were overseas coming back to China, bringing the disease with them. But if you say the increases in disease are coming from people coming from overseas, the implication is that it's foreigners. And I think that's been an unfortunate linkage.
You talked a little bit, you alluded to the two calls that Prime Minister Johnson and President Xi held already this year. Obviously, we all wish the Prime Minister here all the best in his recovery at the moment. But can you elaborate a little on how those calls went and what the highlights for you of those calls were?
Yes, and so we too, of course, wish the Prime Minister a speedy recovery. So I would say the calls had three main components. The first one was the pressing question around cooperation on COVID-19, in particular on shipping parts to the shipping ventilators to the UK and really getting that cooperation going, and an agreement to do that. And we've had agreement at the very highest level of the Chinese government for support in our work to do that. The second area was looking forward to UK-China relations more generally and the potential for their growth and development, both as fellow members of the UN Security Council, but also in some of the pressing challenges. And we haven't really touched much on climate change, but that's an obvious one. Both the Convention on Biodiversity summit, which China was due to host this year, and obviously our own summit in Glasgow have been postponed, but it will remain pressing, I think, to work on both of those. And then I would say the third area was around international cooperation. So the G20 is an obvious case, the United Nations Security Council, but I think covering, what struck me, I think, was the fact that despite the pressing agenda of COVID-19, it was possible to have a strategic discussion, and both leaders were very keen to do that.
It feels like a lifetime ago, but obviously there was the decision by the government to allow Huawei to participate in the 5G networks. Yeah. How significant a move do you think that was on the UK part? How well did that go down in China? And are there ways that we can build on that decision to sort of deepen the trade and investment relationship between the UK and China?
Yes, so I would say that was a very significant decision for both parties. China had lobbied long and hard on the decision, and I think they were quite pleased with the outcome. Officially, they were disappointed by the 35% cap that was placed on Huawei participation, but I think that broadly the decision met with expectations. What does it do for the long-term perspective? I think it does two things. The first is it shows that the UK remains open to FDI from China, and I think that we will see, as our economy comes out through the COVID episode, China's strong interest from China in projects like HS2 and obviously ongoing in Hinkley Point. So I think that will be important, but also it allows us to underline to China the value of being open to foreign investment, and we can continue to push on behalf of British companies, including your membership, for continuing opening of the Chinese market in financial services, pharmaceuticals, energy, all the sectors that we have been working to identify and make progress on.
Okay, we appear to have lost Andrew for the moment, but he is dialing back in, so we should hopefully be back on shortly. We'll give him a few more seconds, otherwise perhaps I can pick up with the line of questioning.
Thanks, Tom.
We have another 5 minutes, so I'll pick up with the next question. So what is the current thinking on post-Brexit Britain pursuing a trade deal with China?
So that's a topic that Commerce Minister Zhongshan and Secretary of State for International Trade Liz Truss discussed in their call just last week. And there's obviously a significant appetite here for free trade deals, but also for free trade more generally and keeping international markets open. I would say that from the UK side, it is more important for us to make real tangible progress. So the fact that we have already started our joint trade review, which is now almost ready for completion, is an important step forward. And the two ministers agreed when they spoke that we should have that ready for the Joint Economic and Trade Council, which we will hope to hold as soon as possible. So continue to make practical steps towards an ambition of free trade, but also keeping global markets open.
So what are the other priorities for the UK-China agenda at this moment and looking ahead?
So I have to say things are very, very much focused on the immediate questions around COVID-19. So getting kit into the UK and making sure the supply chains work, and then looking at the post-COVID economic recovery questions. Those are our absolute priorities. But behind that, I would say the next priority is climate change. I was very struck to hear David Attenborough say just last week that while COVID is killing us this year, climate change will kill this generation. So that is really pressing work. And the fact that we were, as I said earlier, planning to host our summit in Glasgow in conjunction with the Chinese hosting the Convention on Biodiversity Summit, I think becomes more relevant, not less, as we come through the COVID and on to that. And then there's a range of, I think, important global economic challenges around opening up to free trade, sustainable development, green finance, all of those things which we've been working on with China, as well as the international security agenda, looking across Yemen, Afghanistan, questions of conflict in Africa and so on. So we've got plenty on the agenda when we move forwards. And then, of course, questions, as I said earlier, of difficulties. So cyber, I would say, is a challenge that we need to address. Some of the Chinese interference in our academic institutions. And then, of course, Hong Kong has been battened down with its own coronavirus. And there are some questions there around how whether or not there'll be an independent inquiry into some of the protests. So plenty for us to get our teeth into once we get through the immediate and pressing challenges.
It certainly is. What about the impact of the postponement of COP26, which is originally scheduled for November this year? what would you see happening there in terms of impact?
Well, I think it was clear as we were preparing to host COP26, the urgency of agreeing measures that would take us forward from the agreement in Paris. On the current trajectory, we're heading more for 3% than 1.5 or 2%. And we wanted to be ambitious in securing agreements to get that down. But COP, as it was scheduled in Glasgow for the end of this year, marks the beginning of our presidency with the Italians. So I think the important thing is, as we come through COVID, will be to make sure that we come through with strong green and sustainable principles that don't undermine the work that we want to do with COP. And then we'll have the presidency for the whole calendar year after that and look for another date to host a summit where we can try and secure leaders' agreement to some really ambitious targets and also the implementation of those targets.
So we've just come to the end, towards the end of the question part, and so I have one final question. What do you see being the long-term impact here in China on Chinese consumer behavior as a result of COVID-19? A lot of people have been thinking about this subject, and great to hear where you see the long-term impact there.
I think that's a really important question, and obviously very important too for your members. It's hard not to see that there will not be an initial depression in consumer behaviour, simply because unemployment is now running at 6%. And as I said earlier, around 8.5 or 9 million graduates will come onto the employment market in the summer into a sector that is, or SMEs, significantly contracting. So consumption, I think, is inevitably going to be hit by that. But the government has been, as you know, over the last few years, very keen to stimulate consumption. And I think it will continue with that policy as a way of stimulating China's economic growth as well. And of course, we've seen a huge growth in e-commerce here as well. So that will be a very important part of it.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll now hand over to Sherrod to give our closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Andrew. And above all, thank you, Barbara. I think your calm, intelligent, reasoned analysis of the problems we've faced, the challenges we've overcome, the successes we had, shows, if I may say so, how lucky we are to have you as Her Majesty's representative in Beijing at this toughest of times. So from my heart and my head, and I'm sure I speak for everybody on this call, I've had some very nice messages while the call's been underway saying how wonderful you've been on this call. So thank you very much, and good luck as we go down what I'm quite sure is now the exit ramp, at least for China, from this crisis. And could I end by saying, you know, on behalf of us all, we obviously, you know, there's one thing at the top of all of our minds, and that is the health of our Prime Minister, who's is a very great friend of China and a great advocate for engagement between the two countries, and we wish him well in the hours and days ahead. So thank you, Barbara, and the best of luck with the time ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherrod, and thank you once again to the Ambassador for taking the time to speak with us all today. CBBC are running webinars on a wide range of topics over the coming weeks, including the UK education sector and the challenges it faces with COVID, the WeChat mini programs, and safeguarding intellectual property, to name a few of the topics that we'll be covering. I encourage all of today's attendees to follow us on WeChat by scanning the QR code on the screen, or visit our website at cbbc.org for the latest events and publications updates. And once again, this session has been recorded, and the link will be made available soon. That's the end of today's webinar. Thank you all for joining. Please stay safe and well. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye.